Hello and welcome once again to the Doctorpreneurs podcast season 2. And we are available on all major podcast platforms like Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and we are also on YouTube. You may find all our links in our description below. Once again, this is Dr. Lin, and together with me is my co-host, Mr. Andrew Mestrandonis. Hi, Andrew.
Hey, how you doing? We're very excited to welcome our guest all the way from Berlin today, right? You're in Berlin, is that right?
That's correct.
And his name is Phillipp Buhr, and he is the founder and CEO of Marta. Is that correct?
Correct. Thanks for having me, Andrew. Thanks, Dr. Lim. I'm glad to be here.
We got to know Phillipp since I think around last July. We participated in a United Nations program called UN Women, which was helping develop and grow companies in the caregiving space and how to empower women in this space. So Phillipp and I have been talking every week or every other week since July, sharing experiences. We've learned a lot from the European or German experience in caregiving and his company specifically. And maybe he's learned a thing or two from us, hopefully. So this discussion today is about the German experience, the European experience in caregiving, how it might differ from ours. Just a really nice flowing conversation. So we might start off, Phillipp, with maybe you can tell us about what you're doing and how you got to where you are today. Just a little bit of background would be great to start off with.
Yeah, and who you
For
are
sure.
as well, and what is your field of expertise. And I have to say, Andrew, I really agree with you that all these pointers that Phillipp has been giving us over the past few months has been tremendously helpful. So I also want to appreciate Phillipp and say thank to you. Take this opportunity to say thank you. Go ahead, the floor is yours.
Of course, it's been a pleasure. So myself, I have a business background. I've studied business. I've had my own companies in the past, but those were more into the fast-moving consumer goods and nothing as to the complexity of the care market. I've also learned being a management associate to one of the biggest German conglomerates, Bertelsmann, where I could also assist multiple venture investments, and again started to put an eye into that industry, and really saw my passion in wanting to build something myself. And while I didn't come across the right idea at first, and I was taken by a problem that I had in my own family, and that was taking care of my grandparents. So we had moved two of my grandparents into our own house, and we wanted to take care of them firstly ourselves. But sadly enough, the health status deteriorated so quickly that it wasn't possible for us to support this as a family ourselves. And now that's the reality for 75% of Europeans and Germans who have a relative who is in need of care. They're being taken care of at home, because elderly homes are for once not a desired solution, and on the other hand, it's a real estate game that doesn't grow quickly enough in order to cover the demand that we're seeing in Europe, and I believe worldwide. So we were faced a situation of needing to find somebody to take care of our grandparents' parents at home, and thereby looked onto the live-in care market. Now we're talking about a market of non-professional caregivers that have caregiving experience and move into an elderly's home, take care of the household and the basic hygienic tasks and chores that bring you through the day. Now that experience has mostly been terrible. We've worked with 10 agencies. We've had over the years, I believe, over 30 caregivers in my grandparents' house, and sometimes it worked out great, right? We had loving, caring caregivers who became part of the family, and one in particular, Marta, has been with us for over 2 years, and we've celebrated Christmas with her multiple times, and yeah, she was a family member. Now, as she grew older and turned 70 herself, so my grandparents needed more physical support. We couldn't rely on her anymore and had to go back to agencies to find somebody who could provide that service, who's also able to physically lift my grandfather, for example. And the same problem started again. We were mediated multiple times, caregivers that arrived and that told us that they weren't actually aware of the situation of my grandparents, and we clearly saw there's a mismatch. Could be as simple as a dog allergy, somebody coming, and it was clear they had traveled for 24 hours, and we had both expected this for weeks, and now we're back to zero, both ends. And I really question, how can it be that this market is so inefficient? We have platforms for everything nowadays, but not for this type of unprofessional caregiving services. And you soon realize that in the mediation of unprofessional care services in Europe, you have typically 5 parties at least that earn money from one mediation. And their interests are obviously not all aligned and lead to the classical principal agent problems, and don't give an opportunity to actually control any type of process, right? In business, we have 3 different possibilities to control what we're doing. That's input, process, and output controls, and none of them could be put onto an inefficient market like we saw. So we said, hey, in order to actually change something, we first got to own the full value chain of the mediation of unprofessional care services, and that's where we stand today. So today, the company Marta, named after that caregiver that supported my family for so long, is the first point of contact of caregivers and the first point of contact of families. And we're mediating the right caregiver to the appropriate family by onboarding both parties in a fully standardized manner. Hence, we collect about 130 data points on families and trying to understand their specific situation. And on the other hand, we have just under 100 data points of each caregiver, because each caregiver comes with their own experience and also their preference with what type of illness, situational household they're willing to work with. And we provide basically an educated decision that somebody can take. Both parties will be recommended the most suitable counterparty, and they can apply, and we support if there are any questions in that, and take care of all legal, administrative, and insurances that are needed in that process.
How does this distinguish yourself from what you experienced in the agency model when you were going through those 30 caregivers?
For sure. So we firstly got to understand, why is this market still so inefficient, right? Because you can book anything online nowadays, but it seems only this service you can't. And the reasons are multifold, but the main reason is actually that the market of live-in care is particularly defined by Eastern European personnel moving to Western Europe, because we have a large wage gap in Europe, but one labor market, which is quite a unique system. Now, that system, or that harmonization of the labor market, has only come into place since the early 2000s. And firstly, for example, for Germany, it was Poland, I believe in 2004 or 5, whereby Polish workers could easily come to Germany and work with no further regulation as to permits needed or similar. Market like Romania, which is part of this now, has only moved into that direction in the last 3 to 5 years. So the market existed before, though, right? You have those labor movements, despite the harmonization, despite this being legal or illegal. So we're actually facing a market where we see about 80% of the market is in the gray area. Hence, there was nobody who was actually wanting this transparency that we are giving, because it would have uncovered largely illegal structures. Also, all of the parties involved earn sufficient amounts of money to keep the status quo, and wanted to keep the status quo as is. Now, the major difference is that, first of all, no 5 parties earn money on a mediation with us. It's only us. We take a platform fee of just over 20%, and the rest goes directly into the pocket of the caregiver. In a typical mediation, 50 to 70% of the money paid by a care seeker will end up with those parties mediating the care. Hence, we can actually offer on our platform the service for a lower price while the caregiver earns more money. So both parties benefit from this. And obviously, there is usually how care is requested is there's a German agency that talks to a care seeker, and they ask them to fill out a PDF form with the situation of their household and the person in care describing this. That's obviously done in German, and most of the time this is actually still done with pen and paper. Now this needs analysis, how we call it, is scanned and then sent by the German agency to agencies in Eastern Europe, who again try to find the correct caregiver and propose this case to caregivers. Obviously, in that, a lot is lost in translation because we have the issue of language barriers that come up. So first of all, we don't know if the information arrives to the caregiver ever, because there's a principal agent problem in proposing to the caregiver that the case is actually easier and more comfortable than it actually is. We also don't know if the information flows to him, whether he fully understands this situation as is. In our case, all of the information that the family inputs on our platform is directly translated into 5 languages. We can always ensure that in the mother tongue of the caregiver, the caregiver will see the profile and is already being proposed the jobs with the highest match rate based on all of these metrics.
You mentioned earlier that there were like 5 people involved in as intermediaries, and that like something like 70 to 80% went to those intermediaries as opposed to the caregivers. Who are all these people involved in that process previously?
So a family would typically start looking for care by, let's say, Googling, and they'll come to one of the 5 big lead generation companies in Germany for care. And there they will input their super basic information, contact details, phone number, email, and they'll be called by these lead generation companies and questions around the status that they need support with. And from there on, the lead generation company will look at all of the portfolio companies they have an agreement with and suggest all of the services that could potentially help this family. Now, first of all, that's great, right? Because they deliver a value. They point out all of the services that there are. What is not nice about this, that it's often suggested that this is sort of a non-profit organization that mediates you the best 3 providers that are out there in the market based on your individual needs. But that's not the case, right? Those are for-profit companies that are just forwarding those leads to the highest paying bidder they have. And they'll usually sell a lead to at least 3 companies in the respective space that will then try to convince the family to take their services. Now, you'll have, let's say, if we remain in the area of live-in care, 3 agencies that try to oversell each other and usually in that process overpromise the service that can actually be delivered. One of them will actually win over the family and win a consulting contract in order to fill the demand of the family by mediating the request to an Eastern European company. Now, mediating that to an Eastern European company usually works through an intermediary that pools all of the agencies in Europe and then forwards that to multiple agencies. The agencies in Eastern Europe, again, have a similar structure whereby it's less of like a professional large lead generation company that they get their leads from, but rather local people that are basically the street on the feet on the street that way, and generate those leads. And all of them earn money on this mediation, but very little of those parties involved actually provide value to either end.
Right. So if I'm hearing you correctly, basically there are so many layers involved in order for a person in Germany to seek care or to get a caregiver to come in, and so it must have been very difficult for you to kickstart the process when you are eliminating, or rather kind of like making things more straightforward directly from the caregiver to the care seeker. What are some of the challenges that you face, while going through while trying to simplify such a complicated process in the past?
For sure. So the first challenge was actually to solve the problem around the legal aspect of this. As said, large parts of this market are in the gray area, and we obviously didn't want to do that. We firstly got to ensure the legality of our service before doing anything else. And gladly enough, we spoke to one of the biggest law firms in Europe about this problem, and being a pre-seed startup, we couldn't really pay the bill of them providing the full service and for this business model. But they said, hey, we like this idea so much. It's providing so much value to society, and we're so convinced that there is a legal way to actually do this, that we want to be paid in equity rather than cash. And that's obviously perfect deal back then. So that was the first check mark, ensuring that everything we do is legal. The next step was, hey, how do we actually gain traction on the caregiver side, right? Because for me as a German, it's a lot easier to attract families who need care. But going to Eastern European countries like Poland, Lithuania, and Romania, the countries that we are currently predominantly sourcing caregivers from, is a lot harder. And that was actually done through an existing agency. We approached the owner of that agency and found an agreement whereby he would let us look into all of his processes and learn how things are done. So my first step was actually moving to Warsaw for some time and learning about the industry firsthand. So I was seeing how does an agency currently manage all of their lead generation personnel in the different villages. How do they get the leads forwarded to the agency again? How do they work with their German counterparts? And that was super valuable, right? If we wouldn't have that contact, we likely would have had to delay the entire process of go-to-market by some month. Now, after that, we were also given our first contact into the market, and we opened up shop in Romania, because we said, okay, that's the market actually the furthest east in Europe. That's the least mature and brings the greatest challenge. If we can move caregivers from the most eastern borders of Europe to Western Germany, we can easily roll out the other markets, and that's proven true. For example, to open up a new market for us like Poland took us basically a week, because as said, we just internationalize all of the data fields, and it's more of a translation service than the typical startup, which has to try to go into a new market. But yes, building up that structure and gaining the first foothold was difficult, because those are countries that I'm not native from. I don't speak the languages, and it's sort of a multi-level marketing that is happening in the market, and that you have to break through.
Were there any, when you were in Warsaw, were there any things you found to be surprising or interesting or didn't expect?
The mediation was actually even less digital and less efficient than I could have ever imagined. So each and every single day, a person would sit there in the office and write with pen and paper on a piece of paper, really like physically, all of the requests from the demand side that they were getting. And on another piece of paper, they'd lie right next to it. They'd write down all of the caregivers that they were provided by the recruiters in the villages. And then there was a big map of Germany in front of them, because most of the caregivers not only voice a preference as to the care profile that they will ultimately apply for, but also for the regions. Because they might have relatives in those regions. So this person then was sitting there with two pieces of paper, writing down from all of the requests they got, taking only the 5 most important preferences of both sides, looking at the map and trying to find matches. Now, this is obviously super inefficient, but how would you else do it? If you have a family profile, and some of the agencies in Germany, it spans for 15 pages, right? Same goes for caregivers. What is their experience with what illnesses? Where do they want to work? Where don't they want to work? Like, if you have only 10 requests from both sides, it's basically impossible for once to actually match both sides on all of these terms, because then you'd never find two parties getting together. But also just doing this in a non-digital way without an algorithm that actually puts a relationship to all of these fields, impossible. So it was clear that the request was disregarded. The actual effort that went into filling out those 15 pages of needs analysis weren't actually used, but only 5 indicators, and that one on the other hand. So I was actually kind of afraid going to Warsaw, because I'm like, okay, this is now becoming real, right? It had been an idea for so long, and then it was real. But seeing that, how the market worked, I got the confidence to say, hey, the possibilities of taking this into the digital area, it's so huge, the potential, that I was super confident leaving Warsaw again, in saying, hey, we will provide value to the market, and providing this value will be repaid.
Are you still working with this agency in Poland?
We're not working with any agencies, right? So
okay.
We're not relying on any third party, but we obviously still have a good relationship. Looking at the market, we roughly estimate over 5,000 agencies in Eastern Europe, and in Germany alone about 1,000 agencies, and that on each end are trying to win market. So there is a huge market in Germany alone. It's about 600,000 caregivers working in this day in, day out, meaning about 18 billion being spent on this in Germany alone. The European numbers, obviously, you can multiply them roughly by 5, looking at the population of Germany and entire Europe. The good thing about this for us is that at any given moment, a caregiver looking for a job will not be bound to only one agency, because not one agency will not be able to always provide a job for this caregiver, because as said, not each caregiver matches with each family. So the caregivers have a reoccurring need for somebody needing a job, because typically they go into a job for 2 to 6 months at a time. And also they're used to working with multiple parties at the same time in order to shop for the best job. So when we, for the first time, actually launched the feature on our platform that caregivers could scroll through jobs and are being suggested the job with the highest matching rate at first, all over Facebook, they sent us hearts and props for this, because that's exactly what they want to do. And usually they have to talk to 10 agencies in order to see a couple of family profiles that they could apply to, and now they can do this instantly. And we also see that we actually have net negative cohorts, that being those caregivers that we've talked to in the past month. We couldn't necessarily supply a job to them instantly, but as our platform grows and the number of available jobs increases, we can supply more and more caregivers that we've already talked to in the past with jobs, and they constantly come back to our platform and check out the jobs. And with the more jobs we have, the higher the success rate of a caregiver actually signing in and finding the job right that moment that they're looking for.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Very interesting what you're doing. I mean, utilizing technology. I think it's something. I think the whole aged care, even the caregiving industry worldwide is not really mature when it comes to technology yet, and it's really encouraging to see that you are among the pioneers in this groundbreaking technology that you have. Now, you have mentioned the issue of language barrier a few times during this conversation. How do you actually, overcome this issue? Because we are experiencing something similar in Malaysia as well, whereby the care seekers would always want someone that can speak their native language. And the fact of the matter is, there are not that many Chinese-speaking caregivers in the Malaysian market, and the Chinese care seekers represent the biggest care-seeking market in Malaysia. So how do you then overcome? Because I understand that you also have similar issues when it comes to language barrier among the Europeans. Maybe you can shed some light on what you have been doing.
For sure. So for once, we actually have that advantage that a lot of Eastern European caregivers do speak basic German. Nevertheless, the number that actually speaks fluent German is limited. Looking at different needs analysis is, though, you often realize that it is not the companionship necessarily that is the most important for people looking for this type of live-in care, but it's rather somebody who actually takes well care of them, who has a compassionate approach to this job, who takes care of the household. So we do realize that language skills aren't as important as oftentimes people think who receive this type of care for the first time. So this is also a thing of education to the families. That's not the most important. On the other hand, we have a device called the Marta Assist, which is a very simple translator. There are two buttons, you, me, and people speak into that don't speak any German, comes out as German, and vice versa. And while it's something new for the generation that is being taken care of, this works very well. Now, it is obviously important for some illnesses that somebody speaks better German, and that's where the emphasis then put on, right? So we level that out based on the recommendations we do to both parties, depending on the situation of the elderly looking for care, how important we deem that the language skills actually are. In the future, if we look at non-professional care, which can be the only solution for the care seekers that we have, it goes beyond live-in care, right? And we can think of, for example, a daily companionship. And those are usually people within the neighborhood that you mediate. And those are people who much more take care of being there for somebody, listening to a person, helping them out in a state, in a physical state where it's still more important for somebody to be there rather than for somebody to actually do a lot of the work, right? And that falls into the category where we say, okay, that's definitely interesting to us, either moving that onto our platform ourselves or mediating the service, right? We see ourselves as this platform of live-in care only in the first step. We're the anchor point for all services and products that somebody who's in need of care or who's the relative of somebody in need of care needs. Because this entire onboarding process and asking all of these questions to the family gives us a very clear picture what this household will likely need. And we want to be the gateway that really provides that and sheds more transparency onto these services and products.
So are you suggesting that short-term care, companions, a few hours a day who may be locals in the area of a care seeker is something to look at and there's demand for that? And is that more complicated to provide, or do you think your system works in a way that you can do that as well?
So there's definitely a market for that. The difference being to the live-in care market, that the live-in care market is an existing market where we mainly try to pull a gray market onto our platform. The daily companionship, that's something new. While it always has existed, it hasn't always existed for the exchange of money, right? It used to be a thing that neighbors did, but that used to be also, it's a time we are outgrowing, right? With further urbanization and us being able to get everything as a service we buy, all of these services that are usually on the friendship level, they're being eradicated. So now we have to fill that again. So it's something we have to educate the market more, but there's a huge potential for this. Our platform can easily cover that, right? The entire infrastructure that we have built covers more than that. So this is actually earlier in the funnel. Nevertheless, our focus for now is live-in care, but it's not a competition. We see it as an adjacent service. You have the great example of Bootsorg in the Netherlands. There, it's pretty much the only European market where this idea of daily companionship has really taken off well. And this person is more seen as somebody who helps you coordinate everything and all the services you need. This will not be the person who will be with you 8 hours or more a day and really do the caregiving job. That's where somebody else comes in. And I can even see models whereby a companion comes in, checks on the person who receives the live-in care service, allows for the live-in caregiver to have more hours off, because it's a super demanding job where if the family isn't close, you need somebody else who ensures that the caregiver actually has idle time, and that can be provided. Also, as you said, providing more help on those issues that might require somebody to speak German can be covered by somebody local who comes into the household for a couple of hours a week and gives guidance. And obviously also you'll need those professional caregivers still, right? Let's not disregard them. We just see that over 90% of the services that an elderly needs can be provided by non-professional caregivers. There will always remain these tasks that will require somebody to have a professional education, and somebody should do that who has a professional education. And we have sufficient number of examinated caregivers, though, who can provide exactly that bit of care. They can come in for 2-3 hours a week, provide those services that they were educated to do. But today, they're oftentimes occupied with preparing lunch for the elderly or similar. A job that is super important, but that doesn't require the education that they have. And there we are basically alleviating this shortage of examined caregivers by allowing them to do the job that they were trained to do, and that they really can do best.
And you think there's enough of a local labor pool to do these more short-term type of jobs? Because here, at least, we're in a situation of living care mostly anyway, but I don't know how many locals here in Malaysia would want to do this kind of work. And maybe Dr. Lim can talk about that, but it's been a struggle in this market, at least.
Yeah, I think there are people out there that are looking for more of like this kind of gig work, like a couple of hours or more, sometimes more on a regular basis. There are people looking for that, but in Malaysia, I think there's a gap between what the care seekers are willing to pay and how much the local caregivers are expecting to be compensated. So there's still a gap like that, and because care seekers sometimes they're working on a pretty tight budget, more often than not in Malaysia, and even the live-in care is I think it's only affordable among the maybe top 20% of the population in Malaysia, and so this gap that we still see exists in our market, whereby the expectations of the compensation from the caregivers is different from what the care seekers are willing to pay. Maybe Philip, you can share with us how.
Sure. So the demand is definitely there. The supply also, because the price sensitivity in Germany as to these services isn't very high. So people are willing to pay 25-30 euros an hour for this daily companionship. So that's an interesting hourly wage for somebody who mustn't have any education. We're currently, to put this in perspective, at 10 hours of minimum wage in Germany. So it's significantly higher what is being and can be paid for this. And we see a lot of countries, if we look to the US, or as I pointed out, the Netherlands, where this type of service is working. And I believe the most difficult part in this industry is actually the elderly accepting this care, because it's sort of the first step of receiving somebody or receiving care. And most elderly at that stage, they obviously have they want to take care of themselves, right? They don't want to accept that they are not self-sufficient anymore. So that's the greatest challenge I see, because for example, if you speak to the elderly in this market, they're often fine with getting somebody in who helps them with their daily chores, the household chores. But as soon as it's labeled of being like a companionship, it's more difficult, and it's a learning experience, right? Because it's nothing that their parents received, right? It's nothing they saw in the past. But people, especially during Corona times, I believe, have seen that it's more important to also get those social contacts outside the realm of your own family, and have also seen that it's not possible anymore for your family to fully cover that, because your family likely, right, both your kids are working either, or like even like men, women, or diverse, right? We don't want to be discriminating here, right? But it's something new, right? In the past, the generation that is being taken care of, it was the usual status that their daughter or their daughter-in-law took care of them, and that they lived in the same village or even the same household. That's not the case anymore.
Right. Just turning to something different, I'm just curious about this. If I understand it right now, you're mainly focused on the German market. You're supplying labor from Eastern Europe. What other markets in Europe do you think are attractive to disrupting?
Of course. So we do clearly want to focus on the German market at first, because at that the market opportunity is huge. It's quite easily possible for us to expand our entire recruiting to basically any country. As to the demand side, the obvious markets for German startups to expand into, that's typically the DACH area, meaning Austria, Switzerland. They're very similar, not only as to the language skills, but also, for example, if we look at individual markets, for example, the Romanian language is very closely associated with Italian. So there's a great labor movement from Romania to Italy. So that's a natural next step for us. However, we firstly want to really develop the platform. The market is big enough in Germany for now. Learn from that and take the learnings of gathering all of the data that we have, and see how can we build a product, a software product that is universally applicable and really helps out people everywhere.
Not to get into the nitty gritty, but if you look at the other German speaking markets like Austria or Switzerland, have you seen challenges there that are different than, say, in Germany?
For sure, especially in Austria. In Austria, this market for live-in care is a lot more sophisticated and regulated. So Austria is pretty much exactly 1/10 the size of Germany, and you have over 50,000 registered caregivers working there day in, day out. That being said, the government in Austria at some point decided there is this problem of having this type of service, live-in care, which is clearly the second or third biggest service provided to people in need of care. So you can't cut it out, right? There's too many households who are relying on this care that you cannot allow it from happening. But at the same time, the concept of somebody living at somebody's household and working hours not being strictly controlled and not controllable is very difficult for the politicians on the one hand who want to ensure that a person like a caregiver is sort of falling under the normal labor law and being protected. On the other hand, nobody can enforce that. So the model for Austria that shows is to say, okay, we have a sole proprietorship of these caregivers, which usually in Germany and Austria comes with somebody not being obligated to pay any social contribution whatsoever, or there's no minimum wage, there's no maximum number of working hours, and they try to sort of cover that bit by saying, okay, sole proprietorships who are providing this type of care have to pay into a social contribution. It's a lower amount to keep the pay attractive. And there is a replacement cycle of those caregivers. So they're not allowed to stay, let's say, for 6 months in a totally unregulated market. With this extra regulation also comes more support from the government. So there are more funds that can be directly used in order to pay for this service. And ultimately, what we are doing in Germany is we're trying to take this as a role model, and we'd be very happy for the German government to step in and regulate the market further, because it only helps our cause in bringing more transparency and fairness to the market.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought up this issue of regulations, because one of the biggest challenge we face in Malaysia actually is with the regulators, because we are moving, we see the market demand, we are moving forward innovatively, but the regulator seems to be always left behind. And like one of the challenges that we face in Malaysia is pretty much elderly care in Malaysia is completely out of pocket. There is no long-term insurance, long-term care insurance coverage, and there is basically not much of government support when it comes to for care seekers when it comes to caregiving. And basically, we don't, as a caregiving company, I think we fall under the category of being a social enterprise, but we do not get any government help, government incentives. Maybe the things are slightly different in Europe, and based on what you are sharing, what the Austrian government is doing, that's really inspiring. And how do you see all these regulations moving forward in Germany as you continue to expand your business in this field?
So in Germany, there are a lot of pockets that you can look at in trying to receive support if you have a relative who's in need of care. For the type of service that we are mediating, families can typically make use of 4 different funds, which is already great, but it could be better, because still non-professional care services receive only about half the funding as professional ones, even though we know that there's not enough professional services to actually cover the demand. So we're sort of incentivizing people to rely on professional services when it's a solution that doesn't cover the demand. And that is, I believe, one of the core developments that we will see, because or I hope that the politicians know of this. And obviously we're trying to read all of the working papers that also politicians are trying to get to in order to understand the market, because it's a very complicated market to understand. And we've heard along the lines from the last government that they were actually in favor of the model that Austria has been showing us. We've had a change in our government in the past 6 months, so we have to see where our new government, our new coalition will move to, because it's 2 parties that are involved, right? It's our labor minister and our health minister, and they sort of have to come to an agreement, looking at the market we're in.
You talked about a minute ago about professional versus unprofessional in the social context. I wasn't quite sure how you distinguish between professional and non-professional.
Sorry, what I mean by this is an examined caregiver. That means in Germany somebody who's been educated for 3 years in the service, and the non-professional, thereby I mean somebody who doesn't have formal education in this space. But looking, for example, at our platform, the average care experience that a caregiver has is over 5 years, meaning that yes, they are definitely professionals, and I'm sorry for sort of misusing that word, but it's quite difficult. Even in Germany, there is a difference in the wording around both services, but hardly anybody knows about it. The entire wording around this industry is already false. In English, you have the nice saying of live-in care. And in Germany, for example, you talk about 24-hour care, which is very misleading, because nobody can work 24 hours.
Right.
And that is oftentimes the first sort of truth you have to bring to a family that is looking for that service, that it's not 24 hours somebody is working, but that is somebody very human who can provide a service only for so long and can only cover the demand to a certain level of severity until you need to add additional services to cover that.
Yeah, while we are on the topic of professional versus non-professional caregivers, like in Malaysia, we experience a lot of care seekers coming to us and say, so first of all, the 24 hours care thing is something very common that we have here as well. And we always like to joke with the client, saying that our robot caregivers are still under development. We don't have robot caregivers yet. Our human caregivers can only work a certain number of hours a day, and usually we just lightheartedly joke with our care seekers on that. But also I think some of the challenges that we are facing when it comes to this non-professional and professional caregivers is that our care seekers sometimes expect the caregivers, whether they are professional or non-professional, to also cover household chores, which is a whole different work scope. But in the eyes of the care seekers, very often they say, oh, caregivers, you are also a domestic worker as well. So you're supposed to do all these household chores on top of caring for the person that requires care. How do you educate your clients when it comes to this kind of matter on the difference between domestic work helpers versus professional caregivers, or even non-professional caregivers?
Yes, actually, that is something that our caregivers very well do. So it's one of the core services that they provide is taking care of the domestic chores, because that is one of the services that the elderly definitely can't take care of anymore. And when it comes to the caregiving, the idea is that yes, there's the basic hygiene that the caregivers take care of, but if we look into the more professional side, that's where really the ambulatory care services are being used. So it's very clear that that the services provided are to a large degree domestic chores.
Well, that's interesting because I think it's a much different situation here. Our caregivers tend not to want to do most maid-like services. It's just too much in their eyes to be cleaning a house and doing everything around the house and cooking and cleaning and providing personal care to the client. So they will do some of it, but it's certainly much different than a maid service.
And the care requirement of the patient as well. Like some of the patient, they are rather independent, so it's easier for them for the caregiver to do both, right? To take care of the household chores and the person at the same time. But very often in Malaysia, when somebody engages a caregiver, they actually have someone who is bedridden at home on tube feeding, or someone with dementia. So this higher level care requirements certainly prevent some of our caregivers from carrying out doing the household chores at the same time as well.
So for sure, if we have more severe cases, and especially if it's not only one person in the household, but you have two, and they really require high amounts of attention, looking towards dementia, just being with them constantly, then it becomes relevant to get in a third party to take care of domestic chores. But we see that a lot of people who are actually starting to make use of the services in Germany are largely self-determined still at home, and really require, especially for these types of things, services.
Right. So I know, Philip, you said you had 45 minutes, so we're gonna have to wrap this up. But what's your future? What are you hoping to achieve this year? What's kind of your big set of goals for the rest of this year?
So very simple. We want to be the preferred platform for live-in care in Germany this year, meaning that if people look towards attaining this service, they should look with us, because we've done, I believe, a great job in the past of having net promoter scores on both ends of the platform of above 70. So people like us. There's a lot of word of mouth referrals helping us with that goal. But I believe that's something we want to strive to. That's not too easy because, as said, there are incumbents who've been in the market 15 or nearly 20 years by now. But it seems very realistic looking at our performance so far, and obviously taking all of the learnings with that this brings with it.
Without getting into any details, are there competitors looking at what you're doing and wanting to get into the market? What's the situation there?
So there are obviously competitors, sort of the old school
right.
people, but then there have been startups who've looked at the market that we're looking at. None of them has gotten to the point where we currently are, either because they never gained a foothold in the recruiting side, or they couldn't actually get the funds needed in order to break through into this market. And both challenges, I believe, so far we've taken very well. And I believe it's a high operational challenge in this. But by proving over the past month what we've done in such a short amount of time, investors really love our company, and we'll likely close our next funding soon and be able to go ahead with even more energy and power.
Yeah,
Great.
And we certainly wish you all the best when it comes to your next fundraising round. It's really been a great pleasure speaking to you as usual, and really thank you for your time on speaking to us about caregiving matters in Europe and some of the comparisons that we are going that we are experiencing. Andrew, is there anything else you would like to add?
No, this has been fascinating. I always learn something every time I talk to Phillipp. So this has been a great experience, and we really appreciate you being on our podcast. So Dr. Lim, wrap it up.
Thank you so much. This has been the Doctorpreneurs podcast, and with us today is our guest, Phillipp Buhr, all the way from Germany, Berlin. And thank you for making time for us, Phillipp. So for those of you that are listening, we are available in all major podcast platforms, mainly on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts. And for those that are watching us, we are available live on YouTube as well. And all the links will be below. And we will also put up Philipp's links in the description below as well. So if you're interested to find out more about what they're doing, maybe if you are an investor listening to this and you're interested in investing in their company, you can definitely check them out. All right. So thank you so much, Phillipp. Thanks, Andrew. It's been a pleasure. See you guys soon.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.